to let me come and be a professor addressing this highly distinguished audience. It's a great honor for me. And the subject I have chosen to talk about tonight is something of great importance to America as a nation, to the Americans as individuals. It's a subject which has an economical financial impact on your life. You already have a trade deficit. You work very hard to deal with it, but with a huge amount of imported oil, probably at a higher price than what it is prevailing today, that trade deficit will be much larger. At the same time, it might affect the value of the dollar, which might also have an impact on inflation. So something has to be done on that level. Politically, there are some Americans, they really hate to see America depending on Arab oil. But let us get rid of these emotions, I mean the political emotions, and try to examine the facts. And this is what I want to do with you this afternoon, to examine the facts and the possibilities. Try to analyze them for you. And then we together, during the question and answers, we try objectively to reach some sort of conclusions to see what is the future. And to begin with, no one can dispute the fact that this country dominates the world of oil consumption. This is because of the huge economy you have and the lifestyle most of the Americans enjoy for a long period of time. In 1988, the United States has so far accounted for 1/3 of the non-communist world consumption. Though not as impressive on the supply side, the United States, with 21% of the free world's oil production, is nevertheless by far producing more than the second largest producer, Saudi Arabia, by almost 85 percentage points. More importantly, U.S. oil imports in 1988 amounted to 23% of inter-area oil movements in the world, 8 percentage points ahead of Japan, which was the #1 oil consumer and the #1 oil importer. Therefore, there is no doubt that when the United States, this giant country, moves, the whole world will be affected. When your consumption goes up and your production starts to decline, you will affect everybody, but especially you will affect the Gulf region, the largest oil producer in the world, with the real incremental oil at present. And my intention this afternoon, after a brief review of the current situation, is to sketch the likely future path of the U.S. oil consumption under various assumptions about oil prices and economic growth. Then I will deal with the production side, especially regarding the lower 84 states. And finally, with these two components, we can estimate the magnitude of US imports and the extent of its dependence on Arab oil. We then have to examine the geopolitical implications of rising US reliance on Arab oil, ending with some personal thoughts on the policy front. With regard to the past, US oil imports have followed variations in the demand for oil. Since oil production has tended over the past 15 years to decline slowly year by year or remain flat due to the compensating effect of the Alaskan production, the sharp fall in the price of oil in 1986 led to a surge in demand and an accelerated rate of decline, especially in the 48 states. Alaskan production was not able to compensate for that as it did sometime in the past. And your oil imports took off, rising from 27% of your consumption in 1985 to 41% in 1989. It is interesting to note that US incremental imports from OPEC in 1989 compared with 85 amounted to 45% of the increase in OPEC production over the same period. If we accept the official claim that the US policy had led to what happened in 1986, we then conclude that the US is the best friend that OPEC has ever had. Now, how have the sources of US oil imports changed over time? In 1973, the year of the so-called first price shock, the net US imports were 35% of its oil imports consumption. Canada and Venezuela accounted for almost 40% of that. By the time the Iranian Revolution and the second price shock, US imports were above 40% of its consumption, mostly coming from OPEC countries, namely Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, and Libya, who accounted for no less than 38% of your total consumption, your total imports. The years between the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the price collapse of 1986 were characterized in the United States by a massive shift out of oil to other sources of energy, at a time when Alaskan oil was in full production. As a result, the net oil imports dropped to 27%, as I mentioned before. And the Arab share in that dropped by 28 percentage points. For example, Saudi Arabia dropped in 1980 from a supply of 1,000,261 to only in 85 to 168,000 barrels a day. We were, in 1980, #1 supplier to this country, and in 85 we became #8. The rest of the Arab countries as a group accounted for 1/4 of the total, and this shows very clearly. Now, after this, Saudi Arabia started a new policy in 1985 to recapture its market and started to go up again until it became #1 supplier of oil for this country. And Saudi Arabia, for the time being, is accounting for 16% of your total imports, and the rest of the Arab countries as a group accounted for 1/4 of the total. And this shows very clearly the current US dependence on Arab oil. But what about the future? In order to answer this question, we need to examine 3 issues. First of all, the probable course of your oil production. Second, your oil consumption. And third, the countries from which you can get your additional oil requirements. The oil consumption and oil production depends on the price of oil. And the third issue depends on the first 2, how much you need to import. And all these issues depend in turn on the price of oil. So we are facing a vicious circle. But we have to break that. And we have to make certain assumptions and some scenarios. So the first assumptions we can assume is that your oil, your growth, your economical growth, will be between 2.5% up to 3% in the coming decade. I take into consideration the fact that there is a slowdown in economy right now, but hopefully it will be, as they say, a soft landing, which will not take that long, and then growth will become higher, and on the average it will be about 2.5% to 3%. We also assume that inflation will be 5%, the same level you have now. With these 2 assumptions, we also assume 2 scenarios for the price of oil. One is that it will remain at $18 per barrel in nominal term for the remaining part of the century, for the coming 10 years. When I say $18, I mean the OPEC basket, not the price of your North Alaskan slope or the West Texas Intermediate. And the second scenario for the price is a price of oil to be maintained in real terms from 91 until the end of the century. As to future oil consumption, production, we have made separate assumptions with regard to Alaska based on what is recorded and mentioned in your specialized journals. But when it comes to production in the lower 84 states, on the other hand, it is not that easy to predict because of the sharp fluctuations in the level of prices. As you might recall, the increases in the price in the 70s seemed to have arrested the sharp decline in the level of production from those 84 states. And then, with the crash of the price in 86, that decline was much, much more than what it was before. It came down to 4.3%. But what is really disturbing is that exploration activities now are not really what we hope to see, for a variety of reasons. One of them is the low price of oil, but lately for environmental purposes. So we don't really expect much, and we don't expect Alaska to do better. As a matter of fact, as I said, it will start declining. It already started declining. So in order to look at these eventualities, we have to make some assumptions. And I have chosen three scenarios. Either we have a very pessimistic scenario, but it is possible that the rate of decline will be the 4.3% decline which took place in 88 and 89. The second scenario is very optimistic, maybe unrealistic, a rate of decline of 1%. But the third scenario, which is also optimistic, but if you work hard in this country, you can achieve that. It's a rate of decline of 2.7% per annum. And this is the average rate of decline from 1973 up to 1989. Now, if I take all these diverse demand and supply ingredients, it will lead us to a cluster of forecasts of US oil imports all the way to the year 2000. But let us now look at the broad picture. Under the pessimistic scenario of a high declining rate of 4.3% and a price of $18 per barrel in nominal term until the end of the decade of the century, we will have a very serious result. Incremental US net imports, and this is in addition to the 1989 level of 7.1 million barrels per day, will amount to 4.4 million barrels daily by 95 and 8 million barrels daily by the year 2000, representing a share of net imports in total consumption of 73%, which means you would need to import additional oil by the end of the century equal to what you are producing nowadays, and on top of what you are already importing. I personally do not believe in this scenario. I think it is unrealistic. The total non-communist world consumption, based on a nominal price of $18 per barrel, will reach by the end of the century 63.34 million barrels daily, with a call on OPEC to produce 38.1 million barrels daily. We know that the maximum capacity the organization can reach will be 33.45 million barrels a day. So we have more than 4.5 million barrels a day shortage. A smaller amount of this will be enough to raise the price of oil so sharply, or in other words, to create another price shock. And that price shock will correct the imbalance between supply and demand and bring it back to line. The other optimistic and realistic scenario, based on the lowest decline rate for the lower 48 states, over 1% only, and rising real oil prices result in a net import share by the end of the century, which is about the current 41%, which is prevailing now. But if I take the average rate of decline from 1973 to 1989, which is the 2.7%, and I assume a price based on constant real oil prices, which means the same $18, we increase it yearly by inflation. If I do that, then your requirements by the end of the century will reach an additional 2 million barrels per day on top of what you are now importing. But you might ask, from where you get that oil? And I made some close examination for the current and future sources of oil. I have come to the conclusion that Saudi Arabia is likely to capture a quarter of the US net oil imports over the next decade. Canada, Venezuela, Mexico, and Nigeria together may take about 1/3. But I have to remind you that your neighbor Mexico, in order to maintain the level of production nowadays, they have to put up very heavy investments. And if they want to increase that level, the amount of investments is too big. And you have to share in that. You have to help in order to get something more. Venezuela is in a better position. And Nigeria can help, but it is very difficult to increase their production. Kuwait and Iraq will take at least 1/10 each of them. The Arab countries as a whole may well account for at least 25% of your net imports, if not much more than that. So the rising level of US oil dependence on Arab countries of the Gulf over the recent past, which will increase to the level I have just mentioned, explains to a large extent the stance the US has taken on local issues in the Gulf. Notwithstanding the continuing antagonism between Iran and the United States, which had its origin in the Iranian Revolution, oil seems to have focused the US interest in the region not only in favor of its traditional allies and friends, but also increasingly towards countries that until recently would not have been considered well disposed toward the United States. One fully understands the significance of the US attaches to keeping the sea lanes in the Gulf open to international shipping, especially in the Straits of Hormuz. For the Gulf represents an area of mounting strategic importance, as far as it is certainly in the interest of the US to have peace and stability in the Gulf so as to secure for itself a stable and reliable source of over 60% of oil imports in the year to come. And here I included Iran. It is unrealistic to look at the United States' dependence on Arab oil as something that must be avoided, or at least reduced. The policy of import duties and taxes is a cure worse than the disease. America's best interest will be served by considering the Arab countries, and especially the Gulf states, as trade partners and trying to remove all political obstacles. The Gulf states, for their part, are developing countries, and as such need a stable source of income to finance their various development projects, which invariably require imports of capital goods and foreign technology and expertise. This means a market for you. Moreover, some of the Gulf states, notably Iraq, have accumulated foreign debts which have to be serviced at high real interest rates. It is in the interest of those states to secure a steady income from the sale of their major asset. They need both oil price stability and a secure source of demand for their oil in order to be able to depend on such export earnings. What better source of demand can they find other than an economically healthy U.S. with a robust appetite for Gulf oil? One need not be concerned about an oil embargo. Solving the Arab-Israeli problem will remove that remote possibility forever. The Arab countries have proved in the recent past that they are a reliable source of supply. Their share in the U.S. oil imports had risen to a peak of 37% in 1980 from a lowly 15% in 1973. The successive administrations during the 70s had no concern about the buildup of U.S. imports from the countries that had imposed certain restrictions on supplies destined to the U.S. This is definitely because they made a careful political assessment concerning the likelihood of another oil embargo. Thus, the U.S. and the Gulf are locked into a relationship of mutual dependence, which also makes commercial sense. For if the doctrine of comparative advantage in international trade is to mean much, the exports of world's lowest crude oil producers must expand to fill the growing oil needs of the world's largest oil-consuming nation. As you all know, the Arab Gulf states possess the largest reserves in the world, 67% of the total non-communist world reserves. A higher reserve accumulation is more likely there than elsewhere. Ladies and gentlemen, let us capitalize on the fact that Arabs need America as much as America needs them. Stability in the Gulf and a peaceful settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict is an important task for this country, not only because of oil, but also because it is the leader of the free world, a role which will dictate that it pursues its time-honored policy of striving to uphold right, justice, and peace. Thank you very much.
Those wishing to ask questions may approach the microphones here on either side. And I think it would be helpful if you identified yourself so that His Excellency Sheikh Yamani will know who his interrogators are. Perhaps Professor...
With these lights, I'm not going to see who is he.
My name is Mustafa Malik. I'm a freelance journalist. You suggested that American role in the solution of Arab-Israeli problem would help resolve whatever chances there may be of another oil embargo. Now, one reason Americans, I think, have a soft corner for Israel is that Israel is a democratic country. Israelis, whatever else they may be doing, they fit right into the American society. Western ideas, Western work ethic, they are in leaders of science and technology. Now, Arab world during the last decade or more than since 1973 has got a lot of Western resources. Why are you rather impervious to Western ideas? I think literacy rate in your country or in the Gulf states is not very high.
The what?
Literacy rate is not very high in your country and other Gulf states. The democratic wind that is sweeping all Eastern Europe and other countries, I think your countries are still impervious to them. How would you explain that you are still not exposed to the democratic values and values of freedom?
And
no one said it would be easy to be a professor.
and you consider what's happening now in the occupied territories, killing young boys and girls in hundreds, and blowing up houses, and breaking bones of those young boys and girls is democratic, and this is in line with the conscience of the US people. Now, Israel is formed from a group of Western people, mostly coming from Europe and partly from the United States, which brought their ideas and their values. Muslim countries, they have different values and ideas. This doesn't mean that the United States cannot deal except with Western values. We are heading for a new era in front of us, where we will see a large variety of superpowers in the world, not only the two we have right now. And they will all compete in these third world countries for the market and for the resources and everything. I think it is in the interest of the United States to compete with friends in the area of friendly countries. Now, The developing countries, whether they are in the Middle East, the Arab countries, or elsewhere, are working very hard to build their economy, schools, universities. This does not happen overnight. And if you look at what happened in Saudi Arabia in the last 10, 15 years, the number of universities which were built, and schools and highways and industries, this is in the way of a developed country, but it takes time. As you might know, the illiterate people in my country are now becoming much, much less. The achievement is so remarkable, it sounds like a miracle. And this is not only in Saudi Arabia, elsewhere. So we are doing as much as we can, not because of the United States, but because we believe in building our country and having a better life for our people. I don't see a link between this and that. I think America has to help these countries, whether they are Arabs, Africans, or Asians, to build their countries, upgrade the standard of living of the people everywhere, and not to punish them, penalize them for being backwards.
Your Excellency, my name is Ahmed Al-Tahir, and I'm a graduate of the Arab Studies program here at Georgetown. And my question was concerning a recent study. The Bahrain-based Gulf International Bank has concluded in a recent study that OPEC in the 1990s as an organization will be, quote, less relevant as a principal determiner of oil prices because of the downstream refining activities of the big three, namely Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE. And therefore that consumer nations and their refiners in the US, the UK, and Spain will possibly play a bigger role than OPEC in this area, maybe even undermining the organization. What is your comment on this?
Sounds very strange, because if you talk about the downstream activities of those countries compared to the crude of oil they're going to produce and sell, it is far below 1/2 in the case of Kuwait and probably 1/4 in the case of Saudi Arabia. How do you consider the producers of this important commodity not to be in charge of their oil, because the price of oil will be determined in the downstream? The price of oil will be determined by the supply-demand situation. If they don't increase their production to meet the rising demand, prices will flare up, no matter what the consuming nations will do. So it is in the hands of the producers, really, to do whatever is possible. Right now, at a time when it is a buyer's market with a huge surplus of oil, OPEC, with a lesser strength and a much weaker muscle they have, are able to maintain a stable price of oil now for so long, almost 2 years, and the fluctuation is almost nominal. So I didn't read that study, but I have to say it's not really in line with the reality, the economical reality. Thank you.
Sheikh Zaki, my name is Eugene Bird, and my latest incarnation was as coordinator for a call on Congress by 400 Americans who, in general, sought a friendly audience on the Hill the same day that Prime Minister Shamir was there. And we find that there is a change in the attitudes of Americans, of mainstream Americans, a more thoughtful understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian peace. I think that the interfaith call on Congress is just one of many demonstrations of interest by mainstream Americans in what happens in the Middle East on a very balanced basis. We want to see peace. We want to see some of the things you've described. What I'd really like to ask you, however, is concerning oil, because I've just returned from Alaska, and I know a little bit about oil, not anything compared to you, but I have been told that there is going to be a great increase in Alaskan oil production in spite of the oil spill, that the Canadian production from the North Slope is maybe 4 or 5 years away, so that your equation is changed there. Also, the Japanese have just said they would like to get some oil from the United States, from Alaska, instead of having it all come to the West Coast. Would you comment on that and on the EEC and the impact on OPEC of the integration of the European community?
So many questions in one. But I definitely wish you good luck in the Hill for what you're doing, because it is in the interest of this country. It is in the interest of Israel. It is in the interest of the Jewish community in this country to see a peaceful solution. What's happening there is not realistic. If Israel wants to be democratic, as the first question mentioned, they cannot be democratic and continue this policy of occupation, of killing people. They cannot annex the territories and treat the huge number of population, which sometime in the early century, they will become in number more than the Jewish community. It's either they consider them as second-class citizens, like what's happening in South Africa, and then they will not be democratic. They cannot be proud of that. Or they will not have a Jewish state. It will be overpopulated by the Arab citizens. Anyway, we hope that the slow process which we see here and back in Israel and among the Jewish community here will realize these facts and will capture this golden opportunity which might not repeat itself and reach a peaceful settlement. But then we come to the other parts of your questions. You gave me some very good news about Alaska. I'll be more than happy to see this as a reality. But from all the informations we have, and if you read the oil and gas journal in this country, it has the declining rate of the Alaskan production. The major oil field there already started declining. You have more than 100,000 barrels a day drop in the Alaskan production this year, and you'll have another drop next year, and so on. While exploration is not really that promising, and especially what happened for Exxon and that unhappy accident which took place. But maybe the Canadians can do something. I come to a third point you just mentioned, that the Japanese want to buy oil from Alaska. Of course they want to buy oil from Alaska, but you refuse because they want to correct the balance of trade with you, take some oil from you instead of buying your meat or other products. But you refused all the time, and there is a regulation forbidding them from doing that. You are entitled to get your oil than to ship it abroad and import more from elsewhere. So this question of Alaska, even if you can ever arrest this decline, will not change much in the whole picture. But let's hope, I cross my finger and wish something as a miracle can happen in Alaska. But nowadays, miracles are not really a common thing to have. Thank you.
Your Excellency, my name is John Hurley, and my question regards OPEC. You made little mention of OPEC in your speech, and I'm wondering, next year, I believe, is the 30th anniversary of OPEC, and I'm wondering if you would look into your crystal ball and 10 years down the road, and what will OPEC look like in at its 40th anniversary? Indonesia says that they will, in the near future, no longer be able to be a net exporter, and this may be true of other OPEC members.
Though I forgot my crystal ball at home, nevertheless, I can answer the question. You know, OPEC will be different by the end of the century, because, as you said, Indonesia, maybe Algeria, Qatar, and few other countries will gradually disappear as oil exporters. The bulk of the oil will come from the Gulf. At least 75% of the exported oil in the world will come from the Gulf. Venezuela will be another major exporter of oil. So it will be almost Venezuela and the Gulf states. And you will have either a mini OPEC inside OPEC, so strong, and if you follow up what's happening now, with the Gulf states refusing to abide by a quota, unless the discrepancy in giving quotas and the formula is corrected, it shows that they want to impose and get their own right, regardless of whatever pressure they'll be subject for. So I think in the 40th anniversary, OPEC will be much, much stronger than what it is today, but smaller in size. Quality, not quantity. And the reason why I did not mention OPEC is that my subject is related to Arab oil producers. Thank you.
Sheikh Yamani, Charles Ebinger, private consultant here in Washington. I have two quick questions that also require you to put on your crystal ball. The first is looking 10 or 15 years on the horizon, what you believe the energy situation in the Soviet Union and the Eastern socialist countries will look like. Will they take their prodigious reserves of oil, coal, natural gas, and other fuels and become a major player? Or will they become a claimant on OPEC oil and exacerbate some of the problems you've been talking about today? The second one really is perhaps more vexing for OPEC, and that is the growing concern throughout the world about the warming of the planet from the greenhouse effect and the combustion of fossil fuels. And I was wondering to what extent concern about what the greenhouse effect, carbon taxes, and how they would impact the relative price of oil versus alternatives, especially conservation alternatives, what role that plays in your view in OPEC's strategic thinking, or what role it should play if it hasn't played any role to date?
Two important questions. The first question reminds me with a question which was asked with so many questions in a one, and I forgot to answer. The effect of the AEC after the year 92, but then you added this to this, the Soviet Union and the East Bloc. Now, we don't know so much about what's happening in Russia. And we are used to have contradicting views. Now, the Russians made some discoveries lately, and they need some technology and help. And under the new policy, they might be getting help from America and the Western nations to develop their oil resources. We just hope that Russia will not be a net importer one day in the future. That will be very serious and dangerous. And Russia, as you know, started a decline in its production lately. But they try their best to keep the level of exports to the West as stable as they can, because this is their major source of hard currency. And Russia is exporting something between about 1.5 million barrels a day of crude and products. If they can keep that, will be good. But they also export to the satellites about 2 million barrels a day at a special pricing arrangements on barter deals. Now, if the satellites, as we see nowadays, start to get away from the mother Russia, they will definitely be deprived from that cheap source of secured oil at a reduced price. And they have to look for it from elsewhere. And if they start a new system of development, it means their need for additional energy will be more. It will change the demand side. And if Russia gets enough help from the West, then probably it will help in the supply side. But in the oil exploration activities, no one can give a definite answer. We know that there are some promising areas in Russia, but we don't know how promising it is. We hope that with some help from the world community who own technology, Russia can contribute to the picture. Because as I see it in front of me, unless something is done really to correct that situation ahead of time, we might be heading for another serious price shock. And unfortunately, nothing is being done worldwide, because you, as the major consumers, Europe and the others, you definitely do not look long term. It is the nature of Western democracies. You only consider the 4 years in term. Beyond that, it is the problem of someone else. So we just hope for something from Russia to help this. Now, if Europe becomes a big federal state sometime in the future, with some of the Eastern European countries becoming either neutral like Austria, or maybe even part of the Western community, maybe East Germany 5-6 years from now, who knows? This, of course, will have some political impact on the energy scene, especially when it comes to the Gulf area, because they will conduct a policy which doesn't need to be in line with the policy of this country. They have greater need, and they have stronger relationship with the area. But it means additional demands, unless something is done. Now this leads me to your second question, which is very important, the greenhouse effect and the environmental concern. And here you have two areas of impact. You have the impact on exploration, which means less exploration, less supply. And you have the impact on consumption. And then definitely something has to happen. But what is the substitute nowadays? The first thing you have to do is to reduce consumption burning coal, because the effect of burning coal is much higher and greater than oil. And you have to consume more gas. It's clean, but where is that gas that you can replace oil with? But definitely the environmental question is something in the horizon will have a great impact on the consumption of oil, the whole structure. So we have to wait and see. But no matter what it is, all these ingredients together, the components, environments, additional Russian oil, whatever it is, will help. As I said, we might face a situation in the coming decade where you call an OPEC oil production and you don't have enough. In order to increase capacity, you need billions of dollars to do that. The oil producers nowadays, they don't have enough fat to put in that area of additional investments to raise the capacity. So anything in this area will help. Let's hope for a clean environment, and let us hope to avoid the energy crisis.
We have time, I think, just for two final brief questions. We'll take one from the, for balance, we'll take one from the left and one from the right. Lee.
Your Excellency, I have only one question, and I'm a student from Georgetown, Charlie Brown. What will Saudi Arabia do going into the future to maintain a consistent price in oil to help those developing countries? Though, as you pointed out earlier, they need the consistent price for their development to repay the loans that they need to rebuild their economies or build them in the first place.
You mean Saudi Arabia to help the third world in their debts?
No, not in their debts, but the countries that already, the oil-producing countries, the ones that are developing, the Iraqs and things like that, that need the oil to develop their countries further, and the ones that are bringing on production. What will Saudi Arabia do to keep the oil price at about the $18 a barrel level, because of the problem with the West Texas is at $19.90 right now, and if it goes above 2021, it probably will trigger American exploration and American production internally. What will Saudi Arabia do to keep this oil at that $18 barrel price?
We would love to see exploration triggered in this country. I mean, we are not against it. I mean, we have to be honest with you and with ourselves, because we are moving from one era of a supply, a surplus in supply, to a balanced situation, to a shortage in the supply of oil. So we are not against this. As a matter of fact, if we can get a higher price of oil, for the better. In the scenarios I gave, the best scenario, which is difficult but possible, is to see an annual increase in the price of oil. And even with this scenario that I gave, you will face a huge amount of oil to be imported to your country. So I don't see a Saudi policy against increasing the price of oil, because it is in the interest of the consumers and the producers. But maybe we don't see that, because there is a surplus now, and maybe you'll see oil floating in the market, not finding a buyer. The oil companies are doing their best, really, to stabilize the price of oil. They're playing an important role nowadays. But your assumption are not really very correct. And what we do is to let it go. We will increase our production as much as we can in order to get more revenues, of course, to build our economy. And Iraq will do the same. So there is nothing much to do more than that. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question.
The leftist question.
Sheikh Yamani, Nabil al-Khwatar, the Paul Nutzi School of the Johns Hopkins University. In 1980, I was at the University of Petroleum and Minerals, and I remember when you said that oil prices, if they remained at $40 per barrel, would eventually price out oil as an energy source, as a primary source of energy for the world. And if I remember correctly, I, myself, and many friends were very angry to hear that. We didn't believe you, and we thought it was, we just didn't accept it. We didn't know what you meant by it. You were right. How? Okay. But you're not off the hook. I have a question still. Why is it you knew, or at least you saw something that we didn't see, which was that consumers were cutting back on consumption, exploration was continuing in the West and in the East? It's a two-part question. One, why didn't you try to lower prices earlier, say in 82 and 83, when demand was obviously falling? And the second part is it true that the United Kingdom deceived OPEC several times throughout the early 80s by promising that they would not increase production, and then year by year continuing to increase the North Sea production? That's the question.
So many questions. Now, I assure you, what I said in 1980, and even in 79, we were in Caracas, and I told some journalists, at that time we were still increasing the price of oil. It did not reach 30, it was 28. And I told the journalist, I expect the price of oil to fall down and OPEC countries to compete with each other, and there will have a crash in the price of oil. They went running to the Nigerian minister and told him what I said. Nigerian minister said, well, he's joking. They went to the Iranian minister. He wasn't that diplomatic. He said, Yamani is out of his mind. And I repeated that in the speech you mentioned, and I said it. I was very unpopular because I said it in the eyes of the Arabs. It was very clear to me. It is ABC. It doesn't need to be very intelligent. In 1978, with a price of $11 per barrel, the OPEC share in the market was 28 million barrels a day. In 1979, with the eruption of the Iranian Revolution, when the price jumped to almost $30, and in 1980 to 34, 36, and 40, the OPEC share in the market was supposed to drop. There is a divine law. They call it the elasticity of price, of demand. When you have a higher price, you have a lower consumption. It can't be otherwise. But what happened? The share of OPEC in the market went up from 28 to more than 31 million barrels a day. More than 3 million barrels a day. Where did it go? You have to have something less than 28 million barrels a day. So it makes common sense to say that this additional oil is going to storage, to stock, and it will come back again sometime. It will cause a price deterioration, another crash in the price of oil. And this is why I said what I said. And it happened, unfortunately, but no alternative. But I cannot answer your question why I didn't reduce the price of oil. There's a lot of politics there, and this is not the place to discuss it. And I think now, on the same basis, looking at the simple facts and scenarios, we are heading to another price shock unless something is done. And it is very simple. And I assure you I will be right. You will recall this sometime in the future. Unless some miracles happened, I don't know what. So this is the answer for your question.
On the United Kingdom, there was a question on the United Kingdom.
I'm trying to avoid that by my subconscious. I don't think the United Kingdom alone worked very hard to see what happened in '86 happening. I think this country can share to get that credit. I don't say that they deceived us. That's their policy, their country. They will pay the price for it. I don't think it is good in the long run for the United Kingdom economy or energy supply, but it's a major power in the world, a major oil producer. They did what they did. They have their experts and politicians and economists, and they know better. We are outsiders. But it is the so-called free market economy, which works in certain areas and not in others. You allow yourself to dominate the money market and play with it and do and interfere in everything. But in oil, they did their best to see what happened in '86 to happen. And the price will be paid. Will be paid sometimes in the mid-90s or at the end of the century. You cannot avoid that. It's the law of supply and demand. And thank you very much.
Your Excellency, it occurred to me that you're the first professor whom I've called Your Excellency. But I do so with great pride. Perhaps it now has started a new decanal tradition at Georgetown. But thank you for helping us to look beyond 4 years, look ahead, and for putting us on notice with your analytical and articulate glimpse of the future. I would like to reinforce our appreciation by strengthening your library with a couple of books from our Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, the results of a recent symposium on the Islamic world entitled The Islamic Impulse, and a small volume published last spring of essays in honor of Zafar al-Masri, the late mayor of Nablus, in a publication entitled The Palestinians Under Occupation, Prospects for the Future. Thank you very much.
Concludes remarks by Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani. Be sure to join us later in the morning when we'll bring you a number of live programs from London. C-SPAN has been airing programming from the UK over the last week. At about 5:30 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll bring you the state opening of Parliament. Coming up in just a moment, a call-in program recorded in London Monday.
Politicians, entertainers, foreign leaders. Today's newsmakers at the National Press Club. Watch them on C-SPAN. Saturdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Pacific.
You're looking at the serpentine that winds through Hyde Park in London. As part of our coverage from the UK, we'll now bring you an interview with Georgina Henry of The Guardian and Maggie Brown of The Independent. Both are media critics for their respective newspapers.
Maggie Brown, media editor of The Independent. One of the things that the Queen's going to talk about in her address is the decision on the part of Mrs. Thatcher's government to change the broadcasting system in this country. What's it all about?
It's an attempt to open up the system to new players, to make it much more commercial. At the moment, we have a BBC which is funded by licence fees and is non-commercial, takes no advertising, and we have 15 ITV companies who divide up the country in monopoly bits and have the right to sell the advertising time in those little areas, and they all put together some form of commercial schedule. Now, she wants to change the system totally so that in '92, whoever wins the right to broadcast will be paying a lot of money to the Treasury for the right to do so. And the system that's being proposed in the bill that will be talked about tomorrow in the Queen's speech will be a form of auction. The highest bidder will get the rights for the next 10 years to broadcast and sell advertising airtime. It's very controversial, Brian.
Do you think it's a good idea?
I think it's very dangerous. We have actually quite good television in this country. We don't have enough choice, and we would like a lot more different types of programming. But at the end of the day, we basically have established good standards of television which cater for a lot of different types of interest in this country. And all of that now looks as if it's got a big question mark over it.
Georgina Henry, media correspondent for The Guardian newspaper. I was in the tube station, or the subway station this morning, and they were handing out these little documents, which says BSB up to 170 pounds off, and you can sign up to be part of a club. What's this all about?
Well, this is their marketing for British Satellite Broadcasting, which is the UK's licensed satellite broadcaster, which is due to come on air now. We're expecting next March. And this is their launch club that they've started, which is an attempt to get people to sign up and commit money to buy the equipment and also to pay the subscription for their film channel. But they've got a big task ahead because, as I'm sure you know, Rupert Murdoch's been broadcasting Sky Television since February. BSB has already put back its launch date for which was due in September and isn't going on air now until March. And they really have to convince people at a time when, you know, there's a recession due to come in this country, or people expect it, and consumer spending is down. They've got to persuade people after Christmas, which is an expensive time anyway, to buy the equipment and sign up for their service. There's a lot